All right, I believe we are live. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. Welcome to the Center for Open Science's webinar on demystifying open science policy, a funder-focused discussion. I am Miriam Zaringhalam, Senior Director of Policy at COS, and I'm joined by my colleague David Meller, our Senior Policy Analyst. And if you would like to drop in the chat hello and where you are from, you are more than welcome to make use of the chat for its interactive features. And if you have any questions that come up over the course of this webinar, you can make use of our Q&A function and pop those questions into there. So we're really pleased to be joined by Jan Ola Hesselberg, the Chief Program Officer of Stifelsen Dam, a Norwegian funding agency. Frederick Padilla, Director of the Open Science Program at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, and Adam Maxwell, a Research Associate Professor at Virginia Tech. Together, they'll be giving us a look under the hood to see how funders think about crafting, testing, and implementing open science policies. And before I go into further detail on that, I realized I should be sharing my screen. So there it is. Um, so before we get into their perspectives, their views on how funders think about, craft, test, and implement open science policies, like those that we champion at COS, I wanted to give a little bit of background and context setting into who exactly we are at COS. So we're a nonprofit organization with a mission to increase the openness, integrity, and trustworthiness of research. And our true north, what we are ultimately working towards, is life cycle open science, which we define as research with publicly accessible plans, contents like data, materials, and code, and outcomes that are linked and findable in a persistent open location. We believe that increasing access to these elements across the research lifecycle benefits everyone who relies on evidence, which I think is very many people all around the world, including researchers, policymakers, lawmakers, patient advocates, community scientists, librarians, funders, educators, and so many more. So we advance progress towards this true north of life cycle open science through our theory of change, which is built on five mutually reinforcing and highly interdependent activities. Effective infrastructure that enables and facilitates good practices, that makes them possible. Community buy-in to treat these behaviors as good practice rather than administrative burdens, incentives to reward those behaviors and get further buy-in from the community, and policies that formalize those practices. So we see each of these activities as necessary and none of them on their own as sufficient in and of themselves to spur and sustain culture change. Today, our discussion really homes in on the policies piece of and the framework that we've developed here at COS and championed through an advisory board to drive advocacy for policy solutions that are really tailored to meet the needs of policymakers and the communities that they work with. So I will turn it over to David to tell you more about that framework, which is called the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines, or TOP, and is stewarded and benefits from the guidance of our TOP advisory board, which has members in attendance today. Later, you'll hear how elements or see how elements of this framework are put into practice by funders at Stifelsen Dam and the Focused Ultrasound Foundation to govern the work that they fund. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Miriam. And before I talk about anything around top, just as Miriam mentioned, I want to give a big thanks and shout out to the advisory board. There are 21 members of the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines Advisory Board who have been working for years to create, update, and steward the top guidelines. And it's a fantastic and flexible policy framework that I'll go over the details now. And in 2 weeks, we'll be having an additional webinar that goes a lot more in depth about what the top guidelines are. But today, I'm just going to give a quick overview And the meat of the webinar will be about the details of how various practices and additional ones are implemented into great funding foundations. And next slide, please. So, as Miriam introduced just a moment ago, we see policymaking as necessary but not sufficient for creating effective culture change. And one of the most important things about policy change and putting in great policies is to get the timing right. Uh, Anybody on the call should be aware that putting in any sort of mandate before the community is kind of aware or has normalized or has trained up on these types of practices, you're going to be setting yourself up for a big headache. So the policy guidelines are established in a way that helps introduce some of these practices early on in ways that are relatively low burden, and the more advanced levels of the top guidelines create additional ways to increase rigor and transparency. Next slide, please. The overall framework and the purpose of the top guidelines is this underlying philosophy that each of these practices are designed to help increase the verifiability of research claims. So, uh, we all know that the final research paper is a summary of all the great work that went into reporting that finding. And the purpose of TOP is to try to open the hood so that others can verify what those claims, where those claims come from. And a lot of great things can happen once that's possible. Building upon that work is probably the most important, but overall, it's a marker of increasing the credibility of the finding by increasing the ability of another researcher to verify what those claims are all about. So the top guidelines is broken into three discrete functions, all of which are working towards that goal, that objective on the right-hand side to increase the verifiability of research claims. The uh, meat of the top guidelines are those 7 research practices on the left, from study registration down to reporting transparency. We'll give a little bit more detail about all of those, but those are the individual research practices that could be included in almost any empirical research project. And there are different ways that those can be, encouraged or required by the policymaker in question. The 2 verification practices are combinations of those research practices that serve distinct and important purposes. And verification study types are ways that are often um, either underappreciated or are particular methods that um, help to confirm research findings in ways that some find boring or uninteresting or a little bit difficult to get funding or get published, but provide specific benefit to the research community. And so there's, again, specific ways to encourage that those be conducted, funded, and published. Next slide, please. So the 7 research practices are at the core of the top guidelines. Include study registration, which is articulating and putting into the registry when a study is going to take place. If that's done consistently throughout your research community, you can have a complete register of all conducted work, regardless of its final, um, regardless of whether or not it eventually gets published. The first 3 of these research practices I call the planning practices. So putting up a protocol of how the work is expected to be conducted and a detailed analysis plan for how the research questions will be articulated into specific findings. Those are all great practices to conduct in the early stages of a research project, ideally before data collection begins. The 4 later ones are research practices that are outputs that happen as the study is conducted or finished. So the digital and physical materials needed to conduct it, the data that were collected, of course, the analysis code that was created to um, put that analysis plan into action. And then finally, the use of a detailed reporting checklist to make sure that all the important details are included in the final paper, whether that's pre-printed or published otherwise. Next slide, please. Each of those seven research practices can be implemented in policies of increasing rigor and increasing effort to implement those. So the first is disclosure. So a simple statement of whether or not that research practice took place. Was the research registered? Yes or no? Is the data set available? Yes or no? Um, and there's no necessary requirement to implement those. And that's an important first step for just helping to normalize that these are research practices that individual entities might expect, and as a way to organize the reporting process. Stepping up from that is a requirement to share them. So we call that share insight. So put it in a way that a persistent identifier can be created and that citation can be included in the final manuscript. And then finally, the most rigorous and level that takes the most amount of effort is the certification practice. This is a requirement that some third party uses a detailed rubric to assess whether or not that was um, done well according to a discipline-specific best practice. So was the study submitted to a registry in a complete and detailed way at the right time? Is the protocol sufficiently detailed in the way that a peer reviewer would look at it? Is a data set uh, complete and fair, findable, accessible, and reusable? Next slide. These seven research practices, as I mentioned, can be implemented in different levels of intensity. So there might be an entity, a journal, a funder, an institution that's interested in requiring that these outputs be made available. Next slide. Or there could be a reporting checklist that just includes a statement of whether or not these items are available with no requirement to make them available. And finally, it's possible that all of these items are required and that there's some process in place that they are checked against the standard. We really don't see this. This is an expectation that is um, for those who really want to make sure that each item is reviewed to the highest standards of rigor. But this is not an expectation that most policymakers will have the time or resources to implement, at least in the early stages. As I mentioned, the two verification practices are combinations of these research practices. So you can take the data and code and see if you can rerun those reported analyses in computational reproducibility. Or you could see if the study was registered and reported completely. And finally, the total verification studies are specific study types that can be funded or publishable or invited for submission by a policymaker who wants to encourage increased replication studies or to find other ways to support this type of research. And I know I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to pass it now back to Miriam, and we will continue.
Great. And so I will pass it over to Jan Ola Hesselberg, who is coming to us from Norway to share more about Stifelsen Dam's perspective on open science policymaking.
Sure, thanks. Nice to see you all. There are some familiar names here, and it's good to see so many representatives of science here. I'll give you a short introduction into to who we are and how we have thought about open science at our foundation. So I'm the Chief Program Officer at Stiftelsen Dam, the Foundation Dam. We're a foundation by and for health and user organizations in Norway. We were founded in 93 and had our first call for proposals in 96. Our funds come from the National Lottery in Norway, and applications are sent from pre-approved organizations. All applications are screened by us in the administrative staff and reviewed by fixed expert panels. We use the 7-point rating scale, also used by the Norwegian Research Council, and we have 4 assessment criteria. I'll not get into the details there. In last year, we had 4 running programs, one of them a research program. We used 104 reviewers, reviewed 3,000 applications, and granted 1,000 projects and we granted about 40 million euros. We have 1,400 ongoing projects. 250 of those are research projects, and we are one of the largest private funders of research in Norway, and we are 13 people in our staff. So what worries us the most? It's unpublished research and selective reporting of research. Not necessarily unpublished research, but unreported results. So when entire or parts of results are not shared, and we're not talking about them published in the scientific journal necessarily, even though that should be the norm. So you all are familiar with the file drawer problem, and this is something we are really worried about, and we see the consequences of the problem in all the replication issues that different areas of research have, and our field, the health research, is definitely one of the areas where this is a problem. So why is this a problem? Of course, it's not random what results we see. Results that harm commercial interests and research careers are much more often left unpublished, and participants and our end users, we're representing the volunteer sector here in Norway, and user organizations, they are exposed to unnecessary danger when research results are not shared completely. And of course, scarce resources are wasted when we're not doing it right the first time. I'll just mention this trial that we also took part in. I'm one of the co-authors. We looked at 2,100 clinical trials from the Nordic universities and university hospitals. And this is the rate of publishing results from those trials. After ideally, you should share your results fairly quickly, but after 24 months, 52% did not share their results, and 22% never published. There are 80,000 patients associated with these unpublished studies. So this is the infrastructure where we put our money into, and we have pushed for many changes in Norway to make it easier to follow up on the sharing of results. So it's one of the things that we think about. We have done, we believe, a lot, but there's still a lot to do on open science. So in 2016, we started by requiring open access publishing. From 2018, we required pre-registration of all research that we fund, including qualitative research. We implemented the fair data sharing and requirement in 2019, and required that all our projects pre-register in OSF. In 2022, we established a DAM registry at the Open Science Framework. So We have our own registry at the Open Science Framework. In 2024, we opened up our review so that applicants can see who reviewed their application, who's behind the different scores and comments on that application. In 2023, we started to incentivize the publication format registered reports. In 2024, we started a data sharing project where we share data from our reviews and also our ongoing projects so that others can do research on our data. And in 2025, last year, we updated our open research requirements that I'll get back to. And David, you said you shouldn't move too fast because you're setting yourself up for headaches, and we definitely have set ourselves up for headaches. So the registered report requirement or incentivization is one of the things that have produced some headaches. But we think that we're fairly small. We're able to move fast and make changes fast, and we're able to test things that other funders can't test. So we think it's good that we get the headaches and not the bigger funders. So the registered report initiative is one example, because we see that we pick the journals from your list on Center of Open Science. And we see that the journals are not always aware what they have committed to. So they say that they accept registered reports for secondary data, for example, and then they say to our grantees that no, we don't. So there are some issues there, but it's still, we're going to push forward on this still, and think it's one way to ensure better quality of the science that we fund. And next year we will have a separate registered report program where all research done has to be published as registered reports. Okay, so the new open science requirements for 2026 that were published last year is that you will not get funding from us if you have unreported results from previous clinical trials. So we'll check if you have unreported results in databases, and if you have not reported results from finished trials that have finished more than 12 months ago, you will not get funding. Also, we require a pre-registration of a data management plan, and it has to be completed before data collection starts, so before you will get the rest of your funding. And also, we are starting now to require the sharing of analysis code, and this is also something that we'll probably get some pushback on, because we require grantees to share the code in the languages R or Python. They can do the analysis in other languages, but they have to share they have to share the code in R and Python, so that it's possible to replicate by people who don't have the expensive licenses that some of the languages require. Why do we care about this? Well, we care because we think it will make for better return on our investments, better quality research that is made reproducible and accessible to other researchers, end users, and decision makers. We think that researchers and the research environments will get better by when we enforce those requirements. We think they will get better at doing these things. They will learn more, and that will make for better projects in the future. And also, we think it will speed up community development and also decision makers and policies will follow if we can show that it's possible to do it, and we show that it's feasible. I just want to mention at the end, I want to mention we have written a report called Improved Application Processing, where we share data on our projects and analysis and try to argue why we do things the way we do in our funding. And we try to be evidence-based. And maybe this is of interest to some of you. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan Ole. And yeah, thank you for sharing headaches so that we can learn from them together rather than having the same headaches over and over again. At least they'll be a little different. So with that, I am very excited to introduce Frederick Padilla from Focused Ultrasound Foundation. As well as we'll be hearing the perspectives of Adam Maxwell, who is an open science champion who is working with Focused Ultrasound Foundation to pilot and test some of their policy interventions. So over to you.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you for the Center for Open Science for organizing this. I'm Frederick Padilla. I'm from the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, where I lead our open science program and a scientific program on gene and cell therapy. Our foundation is a medical non-profit. We have a mission to accelerate the adoption of focused ultrasound technologies to treat a lot of medical indications. And among other things, so we fund preclinical, veterinary, and clinical research. And I like to say that we are smaller, much smaller than Jan Ole organization. We are a small, specialized, technology-focused foundation. We don't have a large infrastructure, especially when it comes to open science, but I think it makes an interesting study case for this discussion of today. So what is focused ultrasound? And it's really very high level, and Adam Maxwell will go into a bit more detail, but think of it as a modality to ablate extracorporally. So with a very high precision, you can destroy, let's say, tumor tissues with extremely high precision and accuracy without incision in an outpatient settings. In terms of open science, so currently we mandate open access publication, and we cover the field associated with that. Since more recently, we require now data management plans for a very specific subset of projects, namely clinical and veterinary immuno-oncology projects. And the idea being that we are trying to build a data community around these topics. So for that, we provide template, we can provide support. We ask any clinical trial to be registered on clinicaltrial.gov. We also require the final reports really at the end of the study to be publicly released, even if it's before publication. And for that, we created a preprint server with the Center for Open Science. We also now accept if the grantees want to publish on bioRxiv or other public repository. And finally, a couple of years ago, we tried to implement a mandate of public data sharing, again, very focused on preclinical projects in immuno-oncology. We created an open research repository, again, hosted by the Center for Open Science. But to be transparent, and I marked it at work in progress, we didn't have a lot of engagement. And our resources in terms of open science are a bit limited. And so we also didn't have the bandwidth to really create that engagement and force this policy. So I'd say that, again, this is an engagement here that will drive compliance and not the other way around. And this is how, as a funder, we are trying to think of it, of our open science policies. Now, because we are also a technology foundation, we have some specific challenges. One of it is that the technology is very often custom built, even specific to the lab or to the PIs. And so exact replication for us is even if its ultimate goal is frequently not feasible. So There are also associated challenges, of course, with clinical veterinary trials, with access to patients, equipment, and so on. So the goal we are trying to achieve is transparency of methods, of parameters, of findings to enable evaluation, to enable transmission, meaning ease of building upon what we have funded so far, and of course, to reinforce public trust in the research we are funding. And one of the response we are trying to implement is to build a consensus with the community, for example, enacting or writing reporting guidelines, and then enacting a mandate to follow them. So these are a couple of examples. And so again, I think that we need to have the involvement of all the stakeholders in the field to create this kind of sustainable policy, and in that case, sustainable standardization. And to give you a specific example, this is a project we funded that is coming to its end, a multimodality consortium to test 3 different focus ultrasound modalities to treat pancreatic cancer. We worked with 3 different laboratories, each specialized in one of these modalities, and we spent with the labs maybe the first year and a half to just standardize everything we could in terms of of course, the cell lines, the reagents, the procedure, the equipment, and then we shared data, we shared the analysis. We, the foundation, we contracted an external histology core to run assays on the samples. We managed the project online. And at the end of the day, what we found is that even if ideally this is what we would like to see, this kind of standardization is extremely resource intensive. The logistic, the operation, the finance, the time, the sheer amount of time we spent on it. And even if it's a technical success, and I won't share the data here, that's not the point, it's a model that is difficult to scale. So reflecting on what we have done so far, I think open access publication, mandate of preprint publication at the end of the study, these are the easy pieces because, I mean, it's easy in terms of infrastructure. There are clear incentives for everyone, for the grantees, for us. For us also, the compliance is easily tractable, so that's checked. And I wanted to share 2 examples of infrastructure we thought about developing and that we decided to pause. The first is that we investigated opportunity to create our own data repository. And without going into details, our data can be very complex, a mix of very pure data and images and technology and code and so on. And we found that there was we couldn't make an internal case solid enough to justify the investment. And especially because at that time, we didn't have a community to make it very compelling. Similarly, we investigated opportunities to create a core laboratory or to fund a core laboratory to standardize immunoanalysis for the clinical projects we are funding. And again, we found that the resource and infrastructure requirements didn't justify at current scale. And so my 2 cents here is to say that discipline about what not to do is also part, I think, of good stewardship for us as funders. And again, that a policy without a community infrastructure will always be limited in its impact. And so moving forward, we are trying to experiment our way toward building this data community. And we spend a lot of time working with the Center for Open Science and thinking how we could take it to the next step. And we decided to start by testing a more complete open science pipeline and starting with a pilot project. So including prioritization, data management plan, open access publication, data sharing. We are partnering with the Center for the training, the use of the OSF framework and platform to have them engage in our structured check-ins with the PI. And the project we are working on is a project led by Professor Adam Maxwell, which is a veterinary clinical trial, and Adam will detail. And why did we choose this project? And when we thought about what project to use, the first question we were asking ourselves was, okay, with whom are we going to work? And we worked with Adam because we already have an established relationship with him, with Virginia Tech. And that was the case for Honest Foundation for Discussion and Interactive Conversation. And then, as you will see, the project is a well-defined methodology outcomes. So that makes it for clear, testable, open science deliverables. And so I think that it's really important to experiment before enacting any policies. And for that, you need to find the right partners. And I'm very excited to be working both with the center and with Adam. And I will lead him tell his side of the story now.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And my name is Adam Maxwell. I'm a researcher at Virginia Tech, and our lab studies focused ultrasound therapies and develops new treatments using focused ultrasound for a variety of diseases. Today, I'm just going to provide a quick overview of this study, the case study that we're really using to move some of these open science practices forward and try and test them in the context of our own research. So we're part of the One Health initiative, and One Health is really a notion that human health really is connected to the health of animals and the ecosystem, and that all of these impact each other, and that what we learn in one of these domains we can take and apply in other domains. And so how that applies to our own research is that we are involved in developing focused ultrasound therapies for use in veterinary medicine. And this has kind of the dual purpose, one of developing these non-invasive treatments for companion animals like dogs, cats, and horses, but also the translation of this technology to human patients, because many animals share the same types of diseases that humans have. And so what we learn from these trials, these veterinary trials, we can take and apply to developing the therapies for human medicine as well. And so we started a trial recently with the support of the Focused Ultrasound Foundation to treat canine lipoma. And so lipomas are masses that are usually benign, but they can cause mobility issues and cause pain in dogs. Shown here is one of our first patients, Jojo, who had a small lipoma that we treated at the start of this study. But the standard way of treating these right now is through surgery, which carries a number of risks. And so what we're aiming to do is introduce a non-invasive way of treating these lipomas, hopefully to reduce the potential for these sorts of risks in the therapy. And the way that we're doing that is using a specific focused ultrasound technology called histotripsy. This is a technology that focuses very high pressure pulses into the tissue. It creates bubbles in the tissue that actually mechanically break down the tissue into this subcellular homogenized liquid in the region that you targeted. And so we can apply these to the lipomas to break them down, and then the intention is that the body can naturally reabsorb this material. So we set out to do a veterinary pilot clinical trial using image-guided histotripsy to treat canine lipomas in 20 patients. And really, we're splitting this into two treatment arms. In half the cases, we are just treating the patients with histotripsy and then following them afterwards. In the other half of cases, we're treating them with histotripsy, and we're actually using a small needle and a syringe to remove this destroyed material with the intention that one or both of these forms of the treatment will shrink the lipoma. And so for both of these groups, we are following them post-treatment for up to 4 months with regular check-ins to evaluate how the sizes of their lipomas are changing, and any side effects or adverse effects that they're experiencing that may be related to the treatment. And so where does the open science part of this come in? Because this study is relatively straightforward, and because the data we're collecting is relatively straightforward, it creates a good opportunity to test introducing some of these open science practices into the trial in a relatively straightforward manner. And so, as Fred detailed, we have been going through a number of activities. The first is about 4 hours of training and just how to develop data management and sharing plans, and then also how to do a pre-registration of the study. And the Center for Open Sciences helped recommend a number of tools. We ultimately ended up using the two listed here. One is through DMP tool, and the other is through the Open Science Foundation's templates and website for creating the pre-registration. And these one of the things that we found in using these tools is that they have excellent instructions on how you fill out these forms in detail, and as well as examples. And so even without the extensive training, a lot of this felt very self-explanatory, at least to an experienced researcher. One of the details about our study that is perhaps relatively unique is that because we have never done this sort of therapy before, we had to introduce a phase in our first several patients where we are performing pilot treatments, where we are refining the methods, the protocols, the exact protocols for treatment delivery. And so we have this first phase of the process where we're not actually pre-registering and we're not incorporating that data because we're changing our methods slightly with each patient. But the intention is that once we have run through these pilot cases, that our protocols are established, and we will submit our pre-registration and our data management and sharing plans for the duration of the rest of the study. And so at this point, we are still in that pilot phase, but we're about to enter that second phase of the process. And so our takeaways, at this point have been really the team that is performing this research has not all of us have worked together before. So one of the things that we found in developing this data sharing plan was there's a number of practices that and details that we weren't aware of, but really got everyone on board with how we should share the data amongst our team, as well as how we will ultimately share the data with other researchers. And ultimately, I think we feel the value of this is that it increases the transparency and the potential repeatability of a study like this. On the pre-registration side, additionally, it also helped us crystallize some of these specific details about our methods and how our hypotheses are directly going to relate to those methods, the measured variables, and how we're performing the analysis. I will say that the one challenge that I think that has required a lot of discussion in this process is because we are working with because we have these pilot cases, and because we're refining some of our methods, there is this judgment needed about when you officially submit the pre-registration and say we're trying to keep our methods as fixed as possible from this point forward. But also, I think everyone should be aware that there is a substantial amount of flexibility with this process, and that when you do a pre-registration, it doesn't mean you are beholden to not change anything at all, for the duration of the study. You just have to enter what you're changing as you go, and what the justification for those changes is, so that it's transparent how you're carrying out the study. So last, I'll just mention that these are a number of the top guidelines that we are following. We've mostly been emphasizing the research practices, and are planning to implement them in this shared and cited level of detail. But we haven't talked as much about the verification and validation processes yet, but I think those are some things that would be very interesting for us to incorporate into this framework, either in this study or in future studies with the foundation. So that's all I wanted to share, and I'm looking forward to discussing this more.
Great. Thank you so much. And so we can have all of our speakers come back onto the virtual screen. And I'll now turn it over to David for some time for Q&A. I see that already we have one question that's come in from the audience. So please keep them coming if you have any. All right, over to you, David.
First, big thanks to everyone for sharing what you're trying out and sharing what's working well and what you're still figuring out. So that's fantastic to hear. I'll give the first question here, and then I'll take the speaker's prerogative to um, go through my own questions that arose during your presentations. And everybody listening in, please use the Q&A feature to submit questions as they come. But this one comes from Nick Gibson. For representatives of both funders on the call here, what level of staffing have you needed to support implementation and monitoring compliance with these new policies?
So yeah, I can go first. So we really only have one who's monitoring the research program. I think she's here in the chat as well. So it's definitely a challenge. So, but our thought was we'll start by the requirements, and then we'll try to figure out the monitoring later. And I have to say that we worked a lot on securing the data collection from our projects and structuring our database and defining the different variables that we collect from the projects. And now with the large language models, it's a lot easier to make specific apps that do some of the monitoring for you. It's definitely a hard thing to do to make sure that all the requirements are followed, but it's getting easier, and I would recommend you start by securing your data and knowing your data. I'll just mention also that, for example, for pharmacy or for drug trials in Norway and in Europe in general, there's a requirement by law that you share your results within 12 months after data collection has ended. But we have the institution in Norway that's supposed to make sure that the research institutions actually do that, has said we don't have the capacity to do it. And so most of the trials don't report within 12 months. So it's just an example of how important the monitoring is. And that's obviously something you have to work on making happen. And we try to work both at our end, but also at the policy end.
Fred, do you want to share?
Yeah, sure. It's so same here. It's N=1's team, and it's only, to be honest, a small fraction of my time really focused on the open science piece of it. But I think it's more, the discussion is more generally on how you implement it across your institution, meaning that you need the buy-in of course, your leadership. And this is, I saw that we have another question of it, and you need the buy-in of your program team. So for us, we have a couple of program managers that are monitoring all the projects, the different projects we are funding. And so this is them who needs to be involved and that will implement and monitor the compliance to our policies. And for example, we fund a project by milestones. And so one of the milestones at the end of the project is a part of the final milestone is, again, to have your final report on our preprint repository. If you don't do that, you won't be paid. And so it's not to say that it's only the stick and not the carrot, but it's how this compliance, if you want, and monitoring will be passed on to the other member of the team. And it's not one person that is here to really implement and monitor all this open science policy.
Thank you. And Jan Ole, I'm not sure if you saw the question, but a follow-up came through. What level of leadership buy-in do you think is required, or in your experience, is required for this?
Okay, so I think this is probably the main, one of the main obstacles for many funders. There will be huge organizations, and you have to convince a lot of people in the organization and a lot of the stakeholders, and they also have a lot of more responsibility towards their stakeholders than probably we do. So we're a small organization, and we get way too many applications. So it's easier than to say, okay, so one of the ways we'll limit this is to be very strict on our open science requirements. And there's also a good rationale for the requirements. And we have had a very easy sell towards our board, I would say. So they have not objected, and we have taken that position here in Norway. But it's definitely, I would probably think that for many larger funders, this is the main obstacle, trying to convince stakeholders and doing the work internally before for getting those requirements pushed out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the same, and I think the important idea here is that you need to build your case internally before you do anything, and the case has to be built toward the different stakeholders, and it will be different to your leadership and to your team and toward your grantees. So toward the leadership, some things are easy to sell, like again, open access publication, because everyone can easily see the value of it, and implementing, for example, again, for experience data repositories, it's more complex, and it would require more investment, and we still don't have a very good, strong case to make on how that will improve the outcome of our research. And I think this is how we think about it. Right?
You know, do you want to?
Yeah, so I would just want to add that, of course, we also had to sell this internally, and what really helped us was all the good meta science research that's been done out there. So the replication studies that you have been pushing forward and doing, a lot of the work from Brian Nosek, and also the work that we have been part of ourselves, showing that a lot of our research ends up not being published. Those trials have been so important in convincing both our applicants and stakeholders out there, and also the board, that this is the right thing to do. And I think that's the benefit of this, is that it's not hard to argue for why we need this. So it's probably an easier sell than many other things that we try to convince the board to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A question from Emily. We've been talking a lot about requirements. Have there been additional incentives beyond policy requirements? So extra funding or something that's more of a carrot rather than a stick for any of these policies or practices?
So we guaranteed for at our end, we have, if you choose registered report, you're guaranteed a higher chance of funding than if you do not. So we made an algorithm that does that, and that has of course helped. So now about 1/4 of our applicants choose a registered report.
Yeah, and I mean, smaller scale, we support, for example, open access publication fees, and we are testing also the pilot project with Adam, and I'd be happy to hear his side also of the story. We are supporting the cost of this additional work required to add a layer of open science, let's say, on the scientific project. So this is how we are trying to implement this.
A question for Adam. You touched on this in your presentation, but I'm wondering if you can talk about the pre-registration process, and you were mentioning the methods refinement that you're in the middle of right now, and the piloting phase. And I'm wondering whether or not or how the pre-registration process has changed your relationship with that piloting process, or made that longer or feel more high stakes, or just wondering if there's any changes you've noticed with that as a um, side effect of the uh, study registration process.
Yeah, I think thank you. So I think the pre-registration process we were really doing simultaneously with our initial pilot studies. And so as we were, doing the first couple of cases, we were going through the pre-registration and trying and just not redefining, but better articulating what the methods were that we were trying to uh, enact in the study, where we thought we would need to make changes and how those would we would still be able to implement the methods in a way that we could accurately and precisely test our hypotheses. So I think what it allowed us to do was um, be more specific about our hypotheses and about our methods and what we wanted to try to achieve, and say where are the shortcomings in the way that we're collecting data that's not going to give us the exact information that we need to answer this hypothesis, or what methods are we not implementing that we think are not going to, are going to cause variability between subjects and things like that. So one example was we recognized in our third patient that breathing motion can cause a problem with targeting, which is not something that we thought about when we had applied for the grant. But now we recognize we needed to make a relatively major change to our methods, before we went on and continued the study. So I think going through this process is really helpful in ensuring that what you are studying and what you are measuring and how you are measuring it is going to answer your hypothesis, and it gives us a lot more confidence in the next stage.
Awesome. That's interesting to hear. Thank you. Um, got time for just a couple more questions, maybe one or two. Jan-Ole, thank you for sharing the growing pains and challenges you had with registered reports. Despite that, you're still using them, and you just sort of mentioned how there are additional incentives for researchers who are opting into that pathway. Can you tell me, despite the challenges, why you think it's still worth it, or what you've done to try to overcome or get past those headaches?
Yeah, so it just first of all, research indicates it's a better way to do research, but also it just seems so logically evident. It's the best way to do at least hypothesis testing research, and I do research myself, and I've done both registered reports and not registered reports. And I've sat in many meetings where some of my co-authors said, well, we have to wait with the hypothesis. We have to look at the data to see what story it tells us and then make the hypothesis. And I think that happens a lot. And it's obviously a bad way to do hypothesis testing research. And so it just seems like the obvious choice. If we would have designed the system today, I think we would have started there. And what we do, we acknowledge that this is a challenge for many researchers today. It's hard to do. The journals are not always prepared to do it, and reviewers don't know all about it. So we try to do some courses on it as well. We partner up with some others and try to do courses and teach people. And we're flexible when following these projects. We acknowledge are challenges. So I think that's the way to go. And we learn and they learn, and we'll get a better program in a couple of years, probably.
Fantastic. Great to hear. Um, we're approaching the end, or we just got a couple more seconds. I just want to extend my gratitude to everybody for sharing your experiences, the highs, the lows, what you've learned so far. Thank you to all the webinar participants who stayed, asked questions, and hopefully found something useful to learn. Um, Miriam, do you want to close this out?
Sure, I was just typing in the chat. Thank you. Thanks to our great presenters, Fred, Adam, and Janola, for sharing your experiences, and David for running the show with me, as well as our events team here at COS. If you would like to get in touch with us or stay in touch with us, I've dropped the email that you can use, top@cos.io. I think you could also use David or Miriam at cos.io as well to get in touch with us directly. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever in the world you are hailing from.